things spiral out of the ESF's control. Although the threat of monetary reform was gone, the ESF, in trying to defend the dollar, was essentially running a giant Ponzi scheme that was doomed to failure. The steady drop in US gold defied all attempts to plug the drain, and by 1967 the United States was at the brink of a fiscal crisis. The London gold pool failed in 1968 in the face of the largest gold rush in history. Buyers throughout Europe demanded gold, and mob scenes erupted as the price soared. Many refused to accept US dollars as payment. Gold stocks were cleaned out virtually overnight. The trading in gold was colossal. The rush was on because speculators had become convinced that the US was nearing the end of its gold tether. Having tasted blood and scenting the kill, they ripped and clawed the remaining gold stocks from the gold pool. The whole international monetary system was collapsing, with the Treasury controlling its actions. Confidence in the Fed collapsed. The Fed became a joke. The Federal Reserve hurls thunderbolts and nothing happens. It tells the world solemnly that, by golly, it means business in stopping inflation, but it doesn't know how. U.S. deficits spiraled out of control, and the more money these deficits created, the more severe the inflation. The law of supply and demand made this inevitable. Declining currencies accelerate as they fall, and the dollar was crashing against gold, and consumer prices were soaring parabolically. The ESF's Rosa bonds and forward transactions created losses as the dollar depreciated. The ESF soon registered a negative capital position. It was technically bankrupt. A sense of fear of the unknown was being transmitted by the normally cool operators of the New York Fed. Not only was the dollar falling against stronger currencies, but also weaker ones. There was a sense of panic. In newspapers, the Treasury was being openly ridiculed. Then, in 1979, the dollar lost its biggest support. The European community was determined to avoid further inflation, and so the Treasury was told that support from Europe was gone. The vulnerability of the dollar was impossible to describe. Congress was warned that America was about to experience a holocaust of runaway inflation, a cataclysm which would make the Depression seem like a tea party. Then deficits stopped mattering. In 1981, caught in a tide of red ink, administration officials tried, somewhat implausibly, to downplay the traditional view that deficits lead to spiraling prices. Stunned audiences were told that there is no direct or indirect connection between deficits and inflation. The U.S. then ran massive deficits, and inflation went down. The link between deficits and inflation broke completely. For the record, this is the equivalent of an African shaman declaring he has mystical powers and then levitating himself in a ring of fire. After deficits stopped mattering, the dollar soared, and the ESF's profits skyrocketed. In 1980, after dumping 100,000 tons of gold onto the market in a desperate attempt to keep prices down, the Treasury halted regular gold sales. Gold prices then entered a 20-year bear market. Remember the variety of stratagems the ESF used to arm itself with foreign currencies by borrowing from abroad? Well, after 1980, this stopped being a problem. The all-knowing, all-seeing Fed did what it had to do to kill inflation, without ever stopping printing money. We were spending our way to prosperity, enjoying the best economy in years, low unemployment, high profits, trivial inflation, all fueled by our willingness to go deeply into debt in the cause of immediate gratification. It was called disinflation, and it was here to stay. Sure, the majority of financial experts had been expecting a wave of inflation, a rerun of the 1970s, only worse. But things didn't work out that way, thanks to the magic of disinflation. As for questions like, why did interest rates enter a 30-year downward trend? Or, how the hell does this disinflation thing work? Well, they remain unanswered. Why deficits stopped mattering. In the 1980s, the link between deficits and inflation was broken, but the money printing never stopped. How did the ESF pull off this magic trick? Well, it is possible to print money without causing inflation. For example, if the government prints billions, and those billions disappeared overseas, there would be no inflation. This is exactly what happened in the 1980s, when a large part of the US currency went missing, disappearing into the hands of foreigners, and the supply of dollars in the US stopped growing, and ending inflation. This wasn't an accident, since in 1981, administration officials started telling the entire world that deficits don't matter. They knew that billions of dollars were about to disappear overseas. This leads to two very important questions. Where did these disappearing dollars go, and why did they leave the US? Iran-Contra and the Reagan Doctrine. Finding the missing dollars is not hard. The New York Times reported in 1990 that Nicaragua was using a new currency. Against a background of hyperinflation, all Nicaraguans scrambled to convert their Cordobas into American currency. So why did the Nicaraguan Cordoba collapse in the 1980s? Well, John Stockwell gives us the answer by describing the CIA's bloody campaign to destabilize Nicaragua beginning in 1981, the year deficits stopped mattering. When the US doesn't like a government, they send in the CIA to tear apart the social and economic fabric of the country. In other words, creating terrible conditions. To destabilize Nicaragua, the US began funding this force called the Contras. And the Contras, under US direction, systematically blew up granaries, sawmills, bridges, government offices, schools, and health centers. One example of hard proof of the CIA's involvement in all this is the Sabotage Manual, which was a comic book style manual that encouraged Nicaraguans to hurl Molotov cocktails and engage in other forms of sabotage. The Contras also systematically assassinated religious workers, teachers, health workers, elected officials, and government administrators. To help with all this, the CIA provided an assassination manual to the Contras. It caused quite a stir when it surfaced in 1984. This was all part of Iran-Contra, when the United States armed and trained Honduras-based militants to topple the government of Nicaragua, even after Congress made it illegal. The Contras' form of warfare was one of systematic and bloody human rights abuse, of murder, torture, mutilation, rape, arson, destruction, and kidnapping. The atrocities are well documented, and they were financed through the ESF. America was at war with Nicaragua. Navy ships supervised the mining of harbors, while U.S. planes bombed the capital. And this bloody CIA campaign was part of the Reagan Doctrine, an effort to roll back communist regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Nicaragua was just one of many destabilizations, all of which were bloody, horrifying affairs. These thousands of brutal CIA covert actions, which destabilized a third of the countries in the world, are what saved the dollar in the 1980s. That leaves only the question of how these disappearing dollars traveled from the United States to places like Nicaragua. Dollarizing the world. Dollarization is the process whereby the US dollar supplants a country's national currency as the medium of exchange. Many countries have an enormous quantity of dollars in circulation. Where did these greenbacks come from? Well, the most reasonable explanation is drug money laundering, which brings us to bulk currency smuggling, the primary method for expatriating drug proceeds from the United States. This dollar smuggling takes place through air cargo, outbound freighter, and the same vehicles used to smuggle cocaine in. When you add together the cash smuggled out of America by Mexican, South American, and Canadian drug dealers, you realize that the total bulk currency smuggling is huge. This bulk currency smuggling took off in the 80s as a result of an intensifying crackdown on money laundering by banks who were under threat of heavy fines from federal authorities. This campaign against money laundering explains the huge outflow of dollars to the rest of the world. By tightening currency restrictions, the Treasury forced launderers to resort to bulk currency shipments. These controls on bank accounts and wire transfers have grown ever stricter, forcing more and more cash out of the United States. And all these outgoing laundered greenbacks dollarized the world. In Afghanistan right now, the Afghani and the dollar are pretty much interchangeable. The illicit trade in opium has single-handedly introduced the dollar to the region. Meanwhile, the American coca trade has led to mass addiction and the vicious dollarization of Latin America. In 1986, as a result of Iran-Contra, it came to light that the U.S. government was directly developing massive cartel infrastructure in Central America. Thousands of tons of cocaine were brought into the U.S., and the money was used to introduce the dollar to the entire Latin American region. The US dollar is now the standard currency for El Salvador and Panama, and it is simply the unofficial de facto tender in the rest of the region. That's right, nearly every country in the Americas involved in producing, transporting, and using cocaine is using the US dollar as a medium for exchange. Treasury profits from the war on drugs. The huge inflow of narcotics during the 80s did more than just dollarize the world. It also delivered massive profits to the Treasury and the ESF. The government began confiscating enormous quantities of property and cash, and the proceeds were funneled directly into the U.S. Treasury. This was all part of the government's drug forfeiture program, which was radically expanded in the 80s. This innovative effort gave the U.S. Treasury title to any property used in a drug transaction. Federal law now grants the government extremely wide license in forfeiture cases. We've gotten to the point where virtually anything can be seized if it has substantial connection to drug trafficking. And since the Justice Department has budget targets it must meet, federal undercover agents and informants are schooled in the financial importance of arranging a drug sale on or near valuable real estate so that the entire tract can be seized through the government's forfeiture program. Informants are often rewarded with a percentage of the assets they deliver this way. Thus, the family home is fair game for forfeiture if a relative or friend were to use it unlawfully. For example, the government took away the home of a New Jersey woman under the claim it was purchased with drug profits, but the house was actually bought 3 years before the drug offenses. The forfeiture situation is totally out of control. It has become a dysfunctional policy where efficiency is measured by the amount of money seized rather than the impact on drug trafficking. Narcotics units prefer seizing cash rather than confiscating drugs and reducing the supply reaching the streets. Those dogs you see at the border aren't looking for drugs. They are currency-sniffing dogs. It is important to note that the more drugs come into the U.S., the more the Treasury profits. Okay, let's look at the next piece of the puzzle, which involves the largest banking scandal you've never heard of. BCCI, the dirtiest bank of them all. Bank fraud cases are usually dry, tedious affairs. Not this one. Nothing in the history of modern financial scandals rivaled the unfolding saga of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. We never had a single scandal involve so much money, so many nations, and so many prominent people. It was the largest corporate criminal enterprise ever, the biggest Ponzi scheme, the most pervasive money laundering operation ever created for the likes of Saddam Hussein and Colombian drug barons. BBCI was more than just a criminal bank. It had a clandestine division called the Black Network, which functioned as a global intelligence operation and a mafia-like enforcement squad. BBCI was used to funnel money during Iran-Contra. The bank also bribed public officials around the world and was protected by the Justice Department, which tried to derail any investigation. It was in the early 1980s when deficits stopped mattering that the Black Network began running its own drugs, weapons, and currency deals. Senior bankers feared that they would be physically maimed, even killed if they were found talking about the BBCI's activities. It was a really nasty operation, and an integral part of the ESF's global dollar Ponzi scheme. The HIV equals AIDS fraud, the enormous quantities of heroin and cocaine flooding the United States, quickly led to a deadly drug epidemic. By the mid-80s, the ESF's drug smuggling operation was so successful that kids were buying cocaine with their lunch money. The government's role in sparking this deadly epidemic has been reported on many times. For example, Gary Webb, an investigative reporter who won more than 30 journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize, in 1996 wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance. Based on extensive research and backed by a mountain of evidence, Dark Alliance described how the U.S. government was in fact involved in dumping cocaine into California, sparking the most destructive drug epidemic in American history. Now, heroin and cocaine are not healthy things, so if you start distributing tons of them into a country, hundreds of thousands of people will start to die. This is what happened in the 80s, when the ESF's flood of drugs led to a deadly epidemic in the drug-using community. People were dying because their immune systems were breaking down. In 1982, it was clear that this AIDS epidemic was not caused by an infectious disease. There was no evidence that the condition was spreading from person to person, and the general public didn't need to fear an epidemic. The condition did not spread to other family members, hospital workers, or researchers. Unless your life was filled with frequent sex and frequent drug use, you were in absolutely no danger of dying from AIDS. This AIDS epidemic became a threat to the ESF, who was in the process of piping as many tons of drugs into the U.S. as it could. This is because Congress came under enormous pressure to do something because of the hundreds of thousands that were dying. Any crackdown on the true causes of the epidemic, especially drug use, would have been a problem. The ESF fixed the situation by turning to its Wurlitzer and inventing another cause for AIDS, the HIV virus.
We have a long way to go in the fight against HIV. The virus that causes AIDS. 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 The virus that causes AIDS.
Thanks to the HIV equals AIDS fraud, the government handed out free needles instead of cracking down on drug use. To truly understand the facts about AIDS, watch the documentary HIV equals AIDS, Fact or Fraud.
AIDS has failed to spread into the female population also. When the U.S. Army began testing new recruits for HIV in 1984, they discovered an amazing fact. HIV infection was evenly spread between males and females, 50-50, and it's remained that way since then. It should follow that AIDS would be 50% male and 50% female, yet 9 out of every 10 people who develop AIDS continue to be male. This could explain why drug use is more related to AIDS than HIV infection. In the U.S., males use over 80% of all hard psychoactive drugs. AIDS is caused by recreational drug use, and injected drugs like heroin and cocaine are the direct cause of AIDS in 9 out of 10 cases.
The original papers upon which the HIV equals AIDS myth was based were fabricated, and there aren't 26 million Africans dying of AIDS. That is another myth.